Okay, hello and welcome everybody to Science Fiction on Trial. I'm Joe Walton and I'm going to be moderating. My role here is less a kind of all-knowing cosmic magistrate and more somebody who is filled with foolish and ill-informed assumptions, which I'll share with our shockingly brilliant panelists to generate kind of fruitful collisions. And what I would like to do, just to start us off with, is to ask each of our panelists to very briefly introduce themselves in whatever way they would like, and maybe to get us started, to raise one work of science fiction that they feel represents the law, legal issues, issues around law and perhaps justice in ways that are somehow interesting, provocative, distinctive, or worthy of note. So it's that really, really open, wide question. Just name something and tell us a sentence or two about why you think it's interesting. Ida, let's start with you.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Ida Keough, and I am a writer of science fiction. I've recently won the BSFA award for shorter fiction in 2020. And in my day job, I'm a barrister specialising in employment law. My chosen book for interesting legal system has to be China Mieville's City in the City. It's a fascinating book if you haven't read it. The concept is set up by a system of laws whereby two cities, which geographically are intertwined with each other, the cities of Basel and Alcoma, are legally required not to see each other. So people have to unsee across the street to where the other city might be. And it's a fascinating setup, which is then the starting point for a wonderful murder mystery. So it's a fantastic book. If you haven't read it, it's a real treat.
Thank you. Gotham.
Thank you. My name is Gotham. I am an editor with the Strange Horizons magazine. I wrote my debut science fiction novel, The Wall, in 2020. And I sometimes moonlight as a constitutional lawyer as well. The book that I have chosen is Annalee Newitz's Autonomous. And the reason why I've chosen it is because a lot of contemporary science fiction deals with corporate power and the various ways in which corporate power shapes the world. And one way in which that happens is through intellectual property law, through law of patent, law of copyright, and so on, that through which corporations exercise control over knowledge and a whole range of very important public goods and services. And Autonomous takes that logic further. It imagines a near future world in which there is an international patent coalition that has control over life-saving drugs and enforces patent law in kind of summary extrajudicial fashion, and really explores those issues very, very well. So that's my book of choice. Thank you.
Wonderful. Adrian.
Hi, I'm Adrian Chukowski. I'm a science fiction and fantasy writer, probably best known for my spider-related book, Children of Time, which has very little legal stuff in it. I was also professionally a lawyer for quite some time, mostly dealing with civil litigation. In my writing, I think my most legal books are Dogs of War and Bearhead, which look a lot at things like the rights of potential artificial intellects that we might create and things like that, among other things. The book I'm going to throw in is Ian Banks's Surface Detail, more as an examination of justice rather than law, which looks at a society where your kind of uploaded mind can be tortured forever in sort of virtual hells, because this is viewed as the just and proper way to deal with people who don't behave in a proper and respectable manner in your society, as a kind of an extreme form of justice, so to speak.
Wonderful, thank you. That's actually also Elon Musk's favorite banks book.
Oh God, I'm so sorry.
Caroline.
Thank you, and I'm Caroline Mersey. I'm not a lawyer, but I have had an awful lot of them on speed dial in my professional career and a lot of engagement in legal issues. I'm a cosplayer, I'm a book reviewer, including for Strange Horizons, and involved in running a lot of book events, things like Fantasy Book Club, Super Relaxed Fantasy Club, and next year's EasterCon Reclamation 2022. Buy a membership, come, it's going to be awesome. So in picking a science fictional work to do with the law, it's a great opportunity for me to shamelessly plug work by Iona Dutt Sharma. And this short fiction collection in particular, not for use in navigation, is fabulous and contains excellent product placement there, Ida, contains a lot of fiction about legal issues, including they've written 2 stories about railway inquests. But if there's one story in here that I think sings out for me, it's a little piece called One Day Listing, which is about a meteorite hitting a planet. And the point of view character is a lawyer whose job it is to untangle the mess of particularly property law and inheritance law in the wake of a disaster that has created a huge amount of refugees. And it's a lovely window into grief, loss, identity, refugee issues, and kind of the personal impact of disasters like that, and the different ways of making things right. So it's quite a in common with a lot of Iona's writing, it's got a melancholy element to it, but a kind of quiet heroism that I think is really interesting when you think about the roles that lawyers play.
Wonderful. In terms of the law of this Zoom call, I hereby decree a new law, which is that by default will go in that order that we just did. So I
Thank
so
you.
that I won't have to call on people. But if you want to chip in at some point, feel free to put up your hand. Some really interesting themes there. I like in particular China Miéville's kind of imbricated marbled city where these 2 sovereignties share the same space and kind of coexist. And if I remember rightly, there are some places in the city that are crisscrossed so that certain aspects of it belong to one city-state and certain aspects of it belong to another city-state. And I feel like maybe there's an interesting link there with the point about intellectual property, because with intellectual property, something like a science fiction work, for example, we know that there's going to be a bundle of property rights, and we try to treat it as this kind of relatively discrete thing that can be disaggregated into these different relatively discrete dimensions. But we all know in reality as writers that when you create a work of culture, it is fed by myriad multiple influences that are kind of impossible to disaggregate and to assign to particular sources. So there is a sense in which anything that anyone creates belongs to the culture and the society as a whole. So what I'd like to ask for the next question, I think, perhaps those questions of property will run through this. But what I'd like to ask for the next question is really to think about it maybe in a kind of slightly writerly way. So whether or not you are writers, most of you are, how do you approach law in your world building? How do you think about how to create an interesting legal system or to represent the law in interesting ways? And perhaps a kind of connected question, what areas of the law do you think are kind of ripe for reimagining? What areas are writers looking at, or should they be looking at to reimagine in interesting speculative ways? And let's allow the law now to come into effect.
Well, thank you. So let's start with the world building and how legal systems get into science fiction. I've been giving this quite a bit of thought, looking at all the different books that I found which have legal systems in them. And it seems to me that there are really 2 ways in which laws interact with science fiction. There's one style, which is what are the consequences of technology? So can our existing laws cope with, or are they capable of dealing with emergent technology such as AI, automated systems, and these sorts of things, time travel, for example. You have a whole range of books dealing with that, everything from, I Am Robot dealing with artificial intelligence. But then there's the other side of things, and that is, what are the consequences of laws themselves? So rather than looking at your existing law and saying, how can our existing laws cope with technology? You're saying, this is the law that I want to create. What are the consequences of it? So books like Handmaid's Tale, for example, are very much predicated upon the legal system, and then the world builds around it, rather than the other way round. So there are two very different types of legal story that we come across. I find that quite an interesting way to look at it. In terms of my own world building, I've recently written a novella which is called Fish! And that's going to come out from Newcom Press at some point. And in that, I am dealing with an international merfolk refugee crisis. So it's a mermaid book. But in that context, there is a question whether our existing discrimination laws are going to be sufficient to deal with discrimination against merfolk who are now coming into society and starting to live amongst humans in the UK. And I have a scene in that book. It's set up as flash fiction, so it's a mosaic novella. And I have a chapter in that which deals with an employment tribunal looking at whether existing discrimination laws can actually apply. So it's the former, I suppose, of the two. What are the consequences of the emergent technology, or in this case, what are the consequences of an emergent merfolk refugee crisis? So that's where my own world building stands.
I think first of all, I just love that idea of discrimination law and merfolk. And just like I was just thinking about, there's so many issues around species rights, like ecosystem rights and planet rights, and in fact, in some constitutions, like in Ecuador and Bolivia, actually the earth and the planet has rights. That it made me think about those and how they're actually quite closely linked to various science fictional ideas. So I'll take the second question first, reimagining areas of law. And I think that the one area of law I want to see reimagined is sovereignty as a concept, because sovereignty as it evolved in the late 17th century, along with the nation state as an entity, has been at the center of, I think, many constraints upon what we can imagine or what we can do with law. So the idea of sovereignty as being unitary, as vesting within the state, and the state being the only locus of sovereignty, and then of course you have rights only against the state. So it just creates a whole range of legal structures that I think ultimately are extremely constraining. And I think that there's so much scope to think about how in a future world, or in a future galaxy or universe, you wouldn't have the nation state or like any one entity, whether it's an empire or a republic or whatever name you want to call it, as the entity, but you could have a diverse range of entities that exercise power in different ways. You could even have anarchist collectives that, of course, were imagined in the Dispossessed, and there's a long tradition of science fiction that imagines anarchism. So I would like to see a lot of critical interrogation of sovereignty as a concept, and even thinking of worlds without law, if that makes sense. As far as the first question goes, in world building, so I think that for me, the legal system rests upon the political economy of the society that you are creating. So depending on, say the era in which you're in, so if for example, if you're writing in the industrial age, you will have trade unions, and a trade union law is going to be a very, very important part of that world. If it's a medieval, fantasy, you're going to have laws around the manorial estate. Feudalism is going to be like at the center of what you're thinking about. There'll be a lot of things about like, agrarian laws, and of course the history of enclosures and so on. So I think that it really depends upon the political economy of the society that you're building, and often the law will both constitute and reflect the political economy, and I think that will then play out in all kinds of interesting ways.
Yeah, I mean, so world building and law for me, purely because of the way I approach world building, it's the law, like a lot of things, is going to reflect what's important in that world and what are the capabilities of your technology or magic or whatever you've got in that world, but also very much who is important in that world and what do they want prohibited or protected, because that's basically where law flows from. And I think it's very, in the same way as it's very tempting to write a science fiction story that is very abstractly about a particular scientific principle, and that's, yeah, there's a lot, it can be a lot of fun to do so. It can be very tempting to write a science fiction story about an abstract legal principle. If you're getting to the point where actual world building is an issue, though, I think it's important not to forget that these things are human constructed, and they're constructed by a very small slice of the population at any given time, and that slice is the slice that's in control. And so if you're writing any kind of long work with a legal system at its heart, that kind of the idea of who is constructing it and for whose benefit needs to be a major consideration. As far as areas of law go, sort of public law and criminal law is fairly well represented, I think, in the literate canon. Civil law far less so, although I mean Cory Doctorow does a lot about intellectual property law. I'm quite interested purely, because it was the area I used to work in civil law, as in the law that regulates dealings between people. So, for example, with contracts in an unusual setting where you can do unusual things, what might you be able to contract for, and how might that need to be regulated or controlled? One example being Claire North's book Touch. They're the character which is kind of essentially a parasitic mind that can take over other people for a period of time, and it enters into contracts with the people whose body it is taking, in that after the period of time they will get a certain amount of remuneration for its ability to use their body. And although that's being done in the clandestine way in the book, if that was a common thing, if you did have kind of roving intelligences that would like to borrow your body occasionally, it would be a thing where you'd get law and regulations and limits to it to protect the people and to protect the minds. So it's that kind of working out, once you introduce a wild card new possibility into the world, is working out, well, how would that then need to be sort of regulated and governed to stop it becoming sort of some sort of runaway abuse.
I think I'm going to echo a little bit there of what Adrian has been talking about. I think looking across science fictional works, I certainly see a lot of criminal law in particular, and I think that kind of comes from a kind of a genre obsession of rightness of action and justice, and a kind of a criminal law framing of an investigation and a trial that establishes the facts and works out guilt or innocence, leading to justice, and whether or not that is right, and a kind of meta-narrative over that. It feels like that's a thing that we reach for a lot in storytelling. I think less so on the on some aspects of public law. I think what I would be interested in seeing a bit more of is some of the supranational law, so particularly intergalactic law. And it was one of the things that I loved so much about Anne Leckie's Imperial Raj trilogy, in that you have a framing of law that regulates the relationship between galactic civilizations, and that proving a mechanism for the resolution of the conflict in the books. And it made my little kind of legal heart sing to see that. I also see a kind of a lot of a reliance on a very kind of westernized Anglophone model of adversarial justice as well, which kind of plays quite nicely for a dramatic tension where you have representatives and debate, but I don't see quite so much of inquisitorial modes and how that might play out in a genre setting. And I think that would be a really interesting place to explore how that plays through. I think as well, there's some really interesting spaces that genre can go in on the nature of evidence. So things like Max Gladstone's 3 Parts Dead, where through magic you can see the last moments of a murder victim to kind of start to establish what happened and what caused their death. Now, it's in that story, it turns out to be as unreliable as almost any other form of witness evidence, but it's I can see Adrian laughing, but it's a really interesting concept. You have those kind of analytics and the role of machine learning and artificial intelligence and how that plays in terms of codifying our biases versus kind of objectivity. So I think there's some interesting technology spaces, some underexplored areas of law. Particularly, I agree completely in the kind of civil law space. You get odd outliers like Ian MacDonald's Luna books, with the whole framing around contract law being a society based around that. But that kind of fixation on adversarial modes and on criminal justice feels like a very narrow view of law and justice.
Absolutely. And I think one of the themes that was running through there, I think maybe particularly in Adrian's and Caroline's, was this notion of, I guess, what you might call legal rationality or reason. And I'm fascinated by the fact that in my glimpses into legal texts, the idea of reason and the reasonable individual seems to hold a lot of sway and influence. And even in our earthbound selves, we know that there are many different types of reason, and that reason is kind of cultivated in different societies and different cultures and different positionalities within those societies and cultures in different ways. So the question really is whose reason? What I would like to do now is ask a big messy question, which the panelists are welcome to pick up on any aspect of, because I've noticed that we have been kind of hovering quite a lot around issues of sovereignty here. So picking up on Gautam's earlier point about perhaps reimagining sovereignty, reimagining the nation state as maybe not being something that is territorial and macroeconomic and is kind of unitary in this way, and looking forward to post-nation state imaginaries, maybe post-Westphalian we could call them. So who does this in interesting ways? What books are there that do this in interesting ways? One that I can think of is Ada Palmer. Another is Neil Stevenson. Maybe you want to comment on those. Maybe you want to mention some of your own. And what do you think isn't being explored and could be explored? And just to make the question a little bit messier, as well as thinking of future versions of the state, some of those versions might be so radically different that we no longer think of them as states. And so perhaps we're in the territory of anarchism and the disappearance of the state. And we had a question which was, what are some of the works that imagine different forms of anarchist collective? So a very open question for the panel to think about the future of the state power, maybe post-state formations, and perhaps thinking about anarchist aspects of that, if you would like.
Well, that's quite a lot to think about. I think there are two obvious examples that come to mind for me when thinking about nation states being obsolete and micro societies existing in with their own systems and laws. And the first is Dave Hutchinson's Fractured Europe series, which has tiny little nations within Europe, each with their own legal systems, and it's based around the coureurs who are effectively a postal system trying to navigate cross-border. So that's an absolutely fascinating book, and I won't go into any spoilers, but it deals not only with those nation states but with other concepts of the state as well. So I think that's a really good series to look into for this kind of thing. The other is Malcolm Alder's Inframocracy, which is just a beautifully written book. It's extremely crisp. And that again deals with little micro societies. And within each society, the individuals can vote for their own laws. So laws can change from one block to the next, which has some very interesting consequences. So those two, I think, are my choices for micro societies. I wanted to pick up on a point that Caroline made about supra societies and interstellar societies. Because there's a wonderful example of that, which is Christine Catherine Ruch has written a story called The Impossibles. And it is the premise is that they are looking at 25 different interstellar cultures coming together in a single court, which is called the Earth Alliance Interspecies Court. And it's dealt with from the perspective of a lawyer who is kind of stuck there dealing with these awful cases. And everyone is sort of pretty much assumed guilty unless there's a technicality that you can rely on in one of the cultural systems in play. So that's a really fascinating look at supra-societal structures and what happens when you have more than one state to cope with, when you've got one single legal system trying to cope with the lot. I'm going to leave it there, I think, before I steal everybody else's examples.
Yeah, I mean, I think Infomocracy is a fantastic example. So that's definitely, I think it should be on everyone's list for this kind of reimagination. I think some of the other recent examples involving various forms of anarchism, although in localized contexts, for example, Cory Doctorow's Walk Away, I think is an example of that. And I think it's interesting that a lot of the detail and in many of these books, it's kind of breakaways from state formation, and they're like little communities that manage to in a certain way, in a way James Scott kind of way, detach themselves from the state, where you can't see like the state anymore. I think that's something interesting. But I guess like when it comes to imagining a stateless society at a larger scale, or trying to scale up, anarchism, that's where you kind of run into a few problems, because it's kind of easy to imagine how it would work in a contained space, but much harder to imagine that at a galactic level. I mean, I guess that although we don't see a lot of the internal dynamics of the culture, but the culture is, I think, an example of a society that has used technology to, I think, in a certain sense, liberate itself from classic state forms that we are used to. I think a second example, and this is not an example of anarchism, but an example of, I think, a very interesting bunch of things being done around social formations at a galactic level, is Yoon Ha Lee's series beginning with Nine Fox Gambit, right? Because there you have the Hexarchate, and you have this idea of consensus reality, which is that like the reality of the physical world depends on everyone believing in it, and so any kind of like dissent or any kind of resistance literally alters physical reality, and therefore needs to be stamped out. And the various forms that resistance then take in that kind of a consensus reality society operating at a galactic level, I think there's a fascinating exploration of that in those three books. I would recommend that.
I mean, honestly, I think my best examples have been taken. I also, I mean, I think the Yoon Ha Lee is a superb example of that kind of law in action on a kind of a macro scale, and in that case on a scale affecting actual reality. But also the Hutchinson Fractured Europe series is fascinating because it illustrates that dealing with an almost stateless society where everything is fractured into these tiny polities, and dealing with your kind of supra society of your sort of great intergalactic empire with all its different planets is basically the same. Because if you you could scale up Hutchinson's Europe into an enormous space opera setting, where instead of little bits of Europe, you had little planets and moon, and each planet and each moon and each bit of each planet were individual, and it would work perfectly. And so, and in the same way, you can go from that, what's possibly the ultimate super state with the Banks's culture, where everyone is also kind of the ultimate individual, because you kind of get to do everything you want to do. And so you get this very weird circle a lot of the time, that if you push in one direction far enough, you realize you're basically gone all the way in the, all the way around to the other side, if that makes any sense at all.
I have a couple of examples I can kind of add to the micro democracy and anarchy list. So I was really struck as well in Nora Denison's work in the 5th season that you've almost got a context-specific set of micro states. So once we are in a 5th season, the unit of governance, shifts from big kind of nation state type models to your local area and your so it becomes your community and your commune that is where the rules exist, and the focus on survival, and a real shift in law as well, that becomes specific to that environmental disaster, effectively, that when you're in that state, a different set of rules and laws apply to help you get through that circumstance that's been kind of well honed as effective in those circumstances. So there's a kind of a context-specific sovereignty and law piece there. On the anarchist works, I was going to add Cecilia Holland's Floating Worlds to that as a classic, where large parts of it are set in an anarchist society. And there's a lovely sequence where the main character's musical instrument is stolen, but in the absence of a kind of a law enforcement structure to correct that, she has to go and get her own musical instrument back from the people that stole it, and find her own method of justice and reparation in that situation. But I wanted to dwell a bit more on this point around sovereignty, because I kind of have a bit of a bugbear, particularly in fantasy fiction, that we tend to default to a lot of absolute monarchy models based on heredity. And it feels like kind of quite a lazy piece of world building at times, and a lot of tricks being missed around opportunities for accountability and debate and character development. And I wanted to kind of pull out a couple of kind of notable exceptions to that. So one of the things I loved most about Catherine Addison's The Goblin Emperor is that we've got a constitutional monarchy in that story, which has checks and balances. Maya as Goblin Emperor doesn't have, absolute power. He has to persuade his elected officials and his parliament and reach consensus. And there's kind of quite a lot of the plots and character development in the novel comes from him learning how to work the machinery of government and of state to deliver the effects that he wants to have happen. So it was lovely to see that, and it kind of adds an extra layer of character tension. Another one I wanted to pull out is Michelle West's writing, and I think it's most stark in her Sunsword books, where she's built a nation state which is ruled by kings who are semi-divine beings, whose wives are impregnated by gods to create the next generation of semi-divine rulers. But those semi-divine kings have quite constrained power, and in particular there's a really interesting balance between them and 10 particular powerful houses that hold actually a lot of the economic and temporal power within the society, and also have their entire distinct legal rules that apply to them. They have particular powers and privileges. They have absolute rights in relation to their own internal affairs and what happens in their own land and spaces. And again, there is kind of what Michelle West does in those books is, and also in her House War books, is she shows succession and sovereignty and authority and where that comes from and how it manifests in the stories, and it creates space for so much more by way of interesting storytelling and conflict. And I would love to see more of that in our writing.
Yeah, that is such a good point. And yeah, what is it about fantasy fiction? I guess there's something about epic fantasy that makes many writers feel that there are certain ways in which they can be original and certain ways in which they need to stick to these traditions. And actually, everything's on the table. Reimagine it. On the point about scaling up, I think earlier Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed was mentioned. I think that's just an interesting example of a kind of medium-sized anarchist society. And it's not often mentioned. I think it's not something that people remember about it, but actually computation does play an important role in the way that that society works. Obviously, she's writing a long time ago. And I think maybe a book like Cory Doctorow's Walk Away is actually now trying to, with the benefit of being at the level of kind of technological development and sophistication that we are, actually filling in some of the details about how a mass anarchist society would work. And I think Walk Away is mainly focused on the things that don't work. And I agree that it's a little bit sketchy on what does work, with some, interesting rudiments there. So I'd like to go to questions quite soon, but just following on from that, kind of thinking about the state, thinking about the theme that's kind of crept in a little bit is actually that of policing. So the final question from me is, again, a fairly open invitation to talk about policing, maybe kind of post-police imaginaries, post-carceral imaginaries, and also maybe the different forms of justice that these imaginaries might be trying to mobilize. So we've been talking about law, and we have an understanding that this is in some mixed, complicated way related to justice. But just as there are many different conceptions and forms of law, there are many different conceptions and forms of justice. Two of the common terms would be a distinction between retributive justice, and on the one hand, and restorative justice on the other hand. So just the final question from me is to say anything you would like to about the theme of policing and punishment or justice, because not all justice involves any ingredient of punishment.
Well, I think I will start with straightforward crime and punishment, which is touched on in so many works. One of my favorites is Land of the Headless by Adam Roberts, just because it's just such a bizarre conception. The protagonist is beheaded for a crime, fitted with a neck valve and some basic sensory equipment, and is sent off literally headless into the world to try and unravel the crime that he's supposed to have committed. So that's a fascinating, really wonderful burlesque sort of a book. The other thing which I've got to mention before we go, and I think it's been touched on very briefly, is Ian MacDonald's Luna series, which is not only an absolutely stunning series in itself, but has a fascinating legal system and conceptions of justice. There's less of a focus on criminal law and much more of a focus on contract law. But one has this brilliant lawyer, Ariel Corter, who's got to be one of the best sci-fi lawyers of all time. And she can fight with her words, but when necessary, it becomes trial by combat, and she can fight just as well with swords. And I think this is absolutely wonderful twist on how laws are going to work on the moon once different societies are set up on the moon, and it's all resolved in the courtroom, either by your standard contract laws or trial by combat, which I think is absolutely fabulous. So those are my two to end off with in terms of justice books.
Yeah, I've just seen in the comments somebody mentioning the Do Know series, and I just want to give a shout out to that because part of my childhood was reading that the entire Do Know series, and I think that's like a wonderful, children's a take on the workings of law, policing, and so on in a children's context. As far as my books go, I think one fascinating book I read recently is the book called Red Dust by Yoss, the Cuban science fiction writer. I love him and I read everything that he writes. And the protagonist of Red Dust is actually a positronic entity called Raymond Chandler, and the entity itself has picked that name. That entity has to now go and across the solar system and track down another person who can basically change the laws of physics. And there's a lot of like very wry, dry humor about the history of detective fiction, police fiction, a lot of intertextual references that are just like wonderful to read. So that's one book I really enjoyed. I think more classically, I think one theme that you often see, what you see is dealt with quite often is societies where there is no need for policing, and societies that do not actually have a culture of violence, and then through first contact, often with human beings, they in a sense end up being exposed to and developing their own concepts of crime and violence. And I think the best treatment of that is The Word for World is Forest, also by Le Guin. I think dealing with those kinds of issues very well, in that what happens when a society that doesn't find violence and policing necessary meets with a society that's built on that, and what are the consequences. I think that's one very interesting exploration of that theme.
Yeah, I mean, one of the weirdest legal, building on the whole trial by combat thing that I'd mentioned, one of the weirdest legal systems I've run into in a book is in KJ Parker's Colors in the Steel, where the main character is a duelist at law, but the legal system is entirely based on that trial by combat. Your lawyer fights for you. The surviving lawyer has proved your case for you, except that they have a legal system which obviously didn't always work like that, because the judge still spends several hours reading through all the particulars of the case, which make no difference whatsoever to anything that is about to happen, because the whole thing is then decided in 90 seconds of people stabbing each other. Which, as I was a lawyer when I read it, felt very realistic in a number of ways. We haven't mentioned Snow Crash yet. So policing in Snow Crash is entirely corporate, and you're absolutely at the mercy of which sort of corporate police force and jail and whatever you get sent to, and depending on who you have contracts with and arrangements with, you may be treated very well, you may be treated very badly, but it's all entirely and somewhat tongue-in-cheekily privatized. Joe, you mentioned in the chat time travel law, which we haven't discussed, but the idea of time travel justice, and the idea if you had time travel and you could actually, if you won a case in court, if the sentence was that fine, the time stream will now be redressed so that the thing didn't happen, and so that you never actually got wronged in the first place, and what that would do to a legal system where you effectively were constantly erasing your own precedents is kind of mind-boggling.
I'm going to kind of approach this one from a slight tangent, because if we think about some of the purposes of criminal law and set aside kind of justice versus fairness as two separate but related concepts that don't always overlap, and the law is constantly evolving. There is a function there that is about punishment and restitution, but there are also aspects of how we frame our laws and our legal systems that are in the deterrent space. That it is about discouraging people from doing bad things, in the knowledge that if they do a thing, then a particular penalty will follow, and that happens with more or less success. I was kind of quite, just as people were talking, thinking of two things in particular in that space. So of course you have Philip K. Dick's Minority Report, very obviously, which deals with the concept of pre-crime. How do you identify crime before it happens and take action to prevent the harm occurring in the first place? And I think that harm prevention angle is really interesting, rather than seeking justice after wrongdoing has happened. How do we get into a bit more of a preventative space is, I think, really interesting. But as a kind of related question, I've just finished All Systems Red by Martha Wells, the first of the Murderbot books. And again, a lot of that framing is around people and kind of corporate bonds. And so I'm trying to think how to frame this. So you pay a lot of money to a corporation for services and for insurance. And there's a conversation in that where some kidnappers are working out what to do with the person that they have kidnapped. And they decide not to do violence to that person because it would be really expensive, because they would lose their bond and their insurance. So there's a deterrent effect that bit of contract law has built in that is preventing a particular kind of harm. Now, irritatingly, a lot of that comes from the status and power and position of the person that they have kidnapped. If it had been a different person, I think they might well have come out with a different answer, and it would have been, worth the cost to them to have killed the person. But again, it's a different deterrent model of how the law can constrain people's behaviour.
Okay, absolutely wonderful.
Can I just?
Oh yes.
As a general point, in the same way as we often find it very difficult to get out of the idea of the hierarchical top-down state, which seems to go with us into space and wherever we go. The idea of getting away from the modern concept of police as an impartial good force for law, rather than a force to do whatever the people in charge of the society decide needs to be done, and law be damned, is very, very heavily ingrained. It's very hard to get away from it. But obviously it's something that events over the last few years, I think in the same way as I suspect would be very hard these days to do a very, very benign TV police show in the way that we've become very used to watching. I would find it as a writer very difficult to work in a setting where I will just say, well, yes, obviously at this point the town guard come in and they will, now that the heroes are uncovered the bad guy, that's fine and everything will be fine, and or the space police or whatever it is. It's an assumption that we've kind of had ingrained in us over the last century or so, and I think it's proved to be remarkably problematic and remarkably insidious.
Absolutely. So we've got a couple minutes, a lot of questions, and I'm just going to pick up on one that I think moves us in a slightly different direction, which is, tell us about the law and AI, whether that's the regulation of AI or AI-driven law, the use of AI within the law.
Oh, well, the really interesting thing for me for AI and the law is that we just don't have laws currently to cope with AI. I was looking at this issue recently, and apparently about 40% of major companies across Europe and Scandinavia and the UK already use some form of AI, whether that be automated decision making. I mean, it's enormous, and we simply don't have any laws at all to deal with that. We're a very long way off from I Am Robot and the codified laws that come with it, I think. So that's fascinating to me. Is where do we go in science fiction when our current society is absolutely, completely unprepared for the impact of automated decision making, which is going on, and of course you have the difficulties with modern AI, such as bias and confirmation bias built into AI, and particularly with things like facial recognition technology. That we just don't have laws to cope with, apart from our existing discrimination laws, which is a particular fond subject of mine. So I think when we're looking at AI, it's partly going to be a case of not just thinking about completely self-aware individuals. And of course, Adrian can talk much more about that with dogs of war and so on. But it's looking at the other forms of AI that are emerging and seeing where that will take us and where that will go. I think a particularly nice example of AI, though, which might pass by, is an horizon of Somni 451 in Cloud Atlas, where Somni has become self-aware, and the story is looked at after her arrest and trial. So that's a nice little example of AI and where it might be going. But it tends to be that we focus on the policing of it rather than on anything else. I'd be interested to see how other aspects of it are dealt with.
Yeah, I mean, I think that again, I'm broadly agreeing with that. Many of the really cutting edge issues around AI have to do with discrimination, the fact that the output that you get from an AI is only as good as the data that you input. And if the data you input has biases, then those biases will be reflected in what you get as an output. And of course, because there is an assumption that AI is neutral, and when you combine that with the actual bias that runs through it, that's where a lot of the issues arise. The second thing, of course, is the use of AI for surveillance. That we have a lot of that in the platform economy. A lot of that in gig work. One interesting novel that recently published that deals with some of these aspects is S.V. Divya's Machinehood, that is set in a world in which like app-mediated gig work is the dominant form of work, and of course that leads to a whole range of issues. I think that those are some of the I think very, very contemporary issues. A lot of scope for being dealt with in science fiction. And of course, the flip side is that, and I guess we're still quite a way away from this, but at what point do the debates start about AI entities themselves having rights? I think, of course, right now it's still like very speculative. A few novels have dealt with that, of course. But I guess at some point that'll be something interesting to think about.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly the case with sort of AI-style expert systems at the moment, which are a world away from what science fiction generally imagines as artificial intelligence. Giving anything over to one of those systems is absolutely fraught with problems, as has been fairly well publicized relatively recently in a number of ways, because of the innate biases in the data the thing is being given. If it were possible to get past that, though, the idea of, for example, AI lawmakers would be interesting, because it's one of those things. A lot of the laws that get made, a lot of the, especially things like the punitive systems we put in place, are basically very, very inefficient crowd pleasers. They do very little to combat sort of crime going forwards. They look good to the voters or whatever right now. If you had a more dispassionate system looking at things and making decisions for people, you might get quite non-intuitive but very effective solutions that would lead to a much improved society. And doubtless you get a vast amount of pushback to that. Justina Robson's book Paper Hearts is a phenomenally good take on that idea of, well, what if we had an AI design a perfect society for us? And I think that's and the way that people don't necessarily want an AI to design a perfect society for them once it starts trying to do it. So that's definitely a book I would recommend people look up. It's a novella from Newcom Press.
I think, yeah, I would echo a lot of what's been said about the risk of AI and machine learning just kind of encoding our current biases, and we've seen that whether on recruitment decisions and the kind of the way of application sifting, that how that starts to come through. Does it feel like a new issue? In science fiction, I would say not so much. So if you go back to 1978 and you go back to the very, very first episode of a little TV show called Blake 7, you have someone being convicted by an AI court effectively that it is a computer and an artificial intelligence that is weighing the evidence of whether or not Blake is innocent or guilty of this set of very obviously trumped up political charges against him. And the human involvement, there are advocates there speaking for and against and offering evidence to the computer intelligence that is making the decision on guilt or innocence. There is a human being presiding over it, but it is the machine there that is the decision maker and is coming to the conclusion that he is guilty and should be exiled off to the prison planet to exciting adventures. So it feels like we've kind of had this as part of our genre storytelling, these sorts of issues for a while. It feels like the technology is now kind of catching up with some of the things that we've been imagining.
Thank you all so much. I'm going to have to call it there. This has been the most absolutely fabulous panel, and I just feel like we're scratching so many different surfaces. We had some fantastic questions which I haven't had time to get to, about an interstellar Ruth Bader Ginsburg striding the stars, about extraterrestrial citizenship, about Hunger Games style decision-making procedures, more detail about police abolitionism, more detail about the incorporation of power hierarchies into world building. I think we all have plenty to think about, plenty to go away and continue to explore and continue to write. So I would just like to take the opportunity to thank this absolutely fabulous panel. And I will convey the imagined thunderous applause through my Zoom link. Next up in this room, if anybody wants to stick around, we have the fabulous Alison Scott, our guest of honor. And we should also soon, we already do have a trickle of people arriving. So do feel free to stick around. There will also be a final session after Alison, in which Tade Thompson will be in conversation with Caroline Mersey. So yes, thank you again, everybody. And that's it. Peace out.